Hi there, you're watching OpenID Connect Overview, part of the API Academy video series. By the end of this video, OpenID Connect Overview, you'll be able to describe OpenID Connect as an authentication layer and how it complements OAuth 2. Explain how identity is treated as a resource. Describe OpenID Connect's authentication flow. Finally, summarize the general specifications of the current OpenID Connect protocol suite. The OpenID Connect specification is maintained by the OpenID Foundation. It is built upon OAuth 2. Before we proceed, it's important to emphasize that this video will be focusing on OpenID Connect and not OpenID 2.0, which is a different standard with completely different parameters and response body formats. You can think of OpenID Connect as the next iteration of OpenID 2.0, which is in the process of being deprecated. Recall that the OAuth 2 protocol was built for authorization, not authentication. It excels at delegated authorization. Log in with Google? Sure. The OAuth protected API endpoint never sees your Google username and password. It doesn't need to know who you are. In fact, like a discrete bouncer at an exclusive club, it prefers not to. That shiny OAuth access token you present is all the API endpoint needs. Just flash it and the door opens. No questions about your identity asked. This, of course, can cause problems. Within the OAuth 2 protocol, there's no way to verify that the bearer of the access token is the one who originally received it. The access token contains no user information. Whoever presents the access token is considered trusted and authorized. This trust leaves the transaction between the API endpoint and the access token vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle attack. Let's now talk about how identity is handled as a resource by OpenID Connect. As a person, you can have multiple identities. Those identities come to light depending on who or what you associate with at a given time. For example, as an employee, your identity may be marked by a job title, job level, or a specific set of skills. But as a family member, you may likely be identified by your age or relationship to your other family members. Each identity has its own unique set of attributes. The OpenID Connect protocol is an extension of OAuth 2 and works not only to eliminate this vulnerability, but also to fill in the rest of the authentication gaps within OAuth 2, such as better enabling SSO. Within the authorization flow, if OpenID is included as the scope, an additional ID token is generated along with the access token. The ID token acts like an encrypted fingerprint that travels through the flow with the access token. At the API endpoint, it can be decoded to reveal user information for identity verification. A user info endpoint can also be referenced to reveal further user information. If your implementation requires it, the OpenID claims may be included in the access token scope. This will all be predetermined at the time when a client app registers with your API. The API then provides the app with a client ID and a client secret that will be used to eventually obtain the required tokens. If you've watched the Introduction to OAuth 2 video, recall that OAuth 2's primary purpose is to provide authorization in your API security infrastructure, and that the access token provided by OAuth 2 is the token that authorizes the end user to access a resource server's protected resources. However, authorization is only one half of the API security picture. The other half is authentication. Recall that identity is a collection of user information values. Meet Jane. Her full name, date of birth, and gender makes up her identity. Jane is also the resource owner, or end user in our example. And recall that identity is treated as a resource that's owned by the end user. Jane's identity is stored in the resource server. Her identity information belongs to her and her only. In our example, the end user, or Jane, wishes to access the client application, or CoinApp, to view resources that are stored in the resource server. Note that the process of requesting the information resources and identity resources can occur simultaneously. The client application is configured to ask for specific information, also known as claims, from the end user as part of authentication. Any additional information needed about the end user can be defined in the scope parameter associated with OAuth 2. While the scope parameter is shared with OAuth 2, OpenID Connect uses these to request specific sets of information about the user. The basic scope parameters include profile, email, address, and phone. These are also known as standard claims. For OpenID Connect, the profile parameter has the most variety of claims, which can also include name, given name, nickname, picture, gender, locale, and birth date, to name a few. For simplicity, the scope for our example is name, gender, and birth date. So we mentioned how OpenID Connect builds on the OAuth 2 authorization request as a simple identity layer. To make it an authentication request, additional parameters are utilized by OpenID Connect as part of the authentication process. They include display, prompt, login hint, nonce, max age, UI locales, ID token hint, login hint, and ACR values. For a full descriptive list, refer to the latest OpenID Connect core specification. Let's do a bit of a fast forward in this process, which is built upon the authorization flow of OAuth 2. For OAuth 2, you may recall the number of handshakes and redirects required for the client app to retrieve the access token from the authorization server to retrieve the resources from the resource server. However, in this case, the server returns an access token and an ID token to authenticate Jane or the end user. It's also important to mention that a refresh token is also issued at this point of the flow, but for the sake of illustrating this particular flow, we'll bypass it for now. We'll learn more about its purpose in the next video. JOT tokens. Back to the flow. The application then exchanges the access token and ID token for the resources from the resource server. And this is how OpenID Connect completes the authorization and authentication picture. Now that Jane's authenticated via the ID token and is able to retrieve the resources she's requested, does Jane need to start the authorization code flow again each time she makes a new resource request through the client application? Enter the user info endpoint. The user info endpoint is an OAuth 2 protected resource that lives in the authorization server. Its purpose is to return claims about an already authenticated end user. This is particularly useful if the authentication code flow has been designed to request additional information about the end user as a precautionary measure. In this case, to ensure that Jane is still Jane, if she's requesting more resources from the resource server in her subsequent interactions with the client application. Name, gender, and birth date happens to be the OpenID Connect scopes that are required from PiggyBank. If those scopes cannot be fulfilled by the requesting client application on behalf of the end user, the resource server may not return the requested resources or may only return partial resources depending on the implementation of the scope. Let's take a slight step back a bit to talk about the ID and access tokens and how they fit together for authentication. An ID token is essentially a new OAuth token defined by OpenID Connect. It's based on a JSON web token that contains claims about authentication status of an end user and indicates the status of the authentication. An access token provides access to the identity resource for the end user. And if we were to summarize their differences, you can pass an ID token around different components of your client. And these components can use the ID token to confirm that the user is authenticated and also to retrieve information about them. Access tokens, on the other hand, are not intended to carry information about the user. What we're looking at here is a snapshot of a diagram straight from the OpenID site. You can implement the OpenID Connect suite at 3 different levels. 1. Minimal. 2. Dynamic. And 3. Complete. Let's take a quick look at what each level entails. Each level has its own respective set of specifications and guides, and expands incrementally from minimal to complete. This core specification provides a set of standard claims and can be requested by the client application to obtain information about the end user and the authentication event. The minimal level may be a bit deceiving by name. It contains all the core components of the OpenID Connect protocol, including ID token, authentication, third-party logins, claims, and several others as shown on this list. Now, if you want to build on the core specification of OpenID Connect, you can also explore the dynamic package. In addition to the specifications covered by the core, you'll also be exposed to the concept of determining the location of the OpenID provider, also known as making a discovery request. This is done to also obtain information needed to interact with the OpenID provider, including its OAuth 2 endpoint locations. In addition, this specification covers OpenID provider metadata and obtaining OpenID provider configuration information. The Dynamic Client Registration Client specification defines how an OpenID Connect relying party can dynamically register with the end user's OpenID provider, providing information about itself to the OpenID provider and obtaining information needed to use it, including the OAuth 2 client ID for this relying party. The spec covers the following topics: client metadata, client registration endpoint, client configuration endpoint, sector identifier URI validation. This spec also rounds out the dynamic suite of OpenID Connect specs. And finally, we arrive in what OpenID calls its complete implementation package, which, on top of the specifications from the minimal and dynamic packages, include the session management specification and the form post response mode specification. The session management spec describes how to manage sessions for OpenID Connect, including when to log out the end user, and comprises the following topics: endpoint discovery, creating and updating sessions, session status change notification, RP-initiated logout, and validation. The form post response mode spec defines the form post response mode. In this mode, authorization response parameters are encoded as HTML form values that are auto-submitted in the user agent and thus are transmitted via the HTTP post method to the client. An example is also included to illustrate the request, and more importantly, the form pose encoded response. In an increasingly omnichannel world, where end users can now expect to be able to jump from one device or platform to another to consume the same service or product that suits their circumstance, whether it be a banking app, a shopping app, or a food delivery app, the complexity of authenticating users in this omnichannel world is often overlooked and has become an exploit opportunity for attackers. OAuth 2 alone as a framework is no longer sufficient, and this is why OpenID Connect has become more relevant than ever before, as it offers a standardized and prescriptive method for delegated authentication. You've reached the end of the video OpenID Connect overview. You should now be able to describe OpenID Connect as an authentication layer and how it complements OAuth 2. Explain how identity is treated as a resource. Describe OpenID Connect's authentication flow. And finally, summarize the general specifications of the current OpenID Connect protocol suite. We appreciate you watching. We hope you're able to watch our other videos in the API Academy series.